Hey, everybody. Thanks for being here. We're going to go around and do some introductions in a few minutes. I'm going to turn it to Navesha. But before that, I just wanted to say a couple words about this gathering. And I gather we have quite some people on the phone. So welcome to you as well. I wish we could see you. I wish we could all be together. I wanted to start out by saying thanks to our GradNation team, to Monica and Navesha and Liz. Where's Liz?
She's checking on more people downstairs.
She's checking on more people downstairs. All of whom have done really great work and put this nice meeting together as well. So let me just make a couple of points as we get started this morning, and then I'm really looking forward to participating in the conversation. So we've led this GradNation campaign since about 2007, and with lots of partners, many of whom are represented here or on the phone. And it's really, it's worth noting that it's been a pretty remarkable success. When we started, the graduation rate was about 71%, and the graduation rate now is almost 85%. That's over about a dozen years, and that means, that's big. That means that an additional 4 million kids were able to walk across the stage with their classmates. That's huge. We don't pretend that graduating from high school means everything's awesome and you're just on the road to success. But we also know, and this is important, that not graduating from high school means you're definitely not on the road to success, and you're probably on the way to a world of hurt. So it's no small thing, those 4 million young people, for themselves, for their families, their communities, for the economy. It's important. But over the last 3 years, especially, we've seen the rate of increase in high school graduation rates flatten. For a whole bunch of years, it was over 1% gain per year, and faster even in some places, like in Chicago. For the last 3 years, it's been roughly a 0.5 percentage point per year. Not great. Not shocking. We also, by the way, see it state by state. As states get to some percentage between 85 and 90, their rate of growth flattens. Sometimes it actually even declines a little bit for four-year graduation rates. So it's hardly surprising that it gets harder. You hike up a mountain, the air gets thinner, it's harder to get oxygen, right? So we think about how do we continue the progress and recognize that this is likely one of those what got you there, what you got us here won't get us there kind of situations, which has got us thinking about like what else needs to happen to continue this growth in graduation and to continue to close the disparities between various population groups and how they're performing. Second, while the graduation rate has definitely increased, we want to be sure that we aren't cheating young people by graduating them, but not having them really be ready for whatever it is that's coming next. We know that there's skepticism about the rate of increase. We know that there are individual instances in which, in fact, districts have fudged various things in order to meet numbers. The new Building GradNation report will come out in a couple of weeks, and I think it'll be very powerful in defeating the notion that it's like one giant cheat. It's not one giant cheat. There are real gains. But we don't just want young people to graduate from high school. We want young people to achieve adult success. And having people graduate from high school without being ready is not doing any service to those young people. So we think, and ready for whatever they do next, whether it's more school, or it's work, or it's military service, or it's national service, or, as is the case for many people, it's some combination of all those things in not a particularly linear fashion. Whatever it is, you got to be ready to do that. And that brings me to my last point, and something we'll talk about a lot today, which brings together, I think, the importance of graduating more young people and continuing to close the gaps in population subgroups, and the importance of young people truly being ready for whatever comes after high school graduation. And that is that more and more we've seen the need to embrace a comprehensive view and approach that embraces the comprehensive development of young people in schools. And whether you call this social emotional learning or social emotional and cognitive development or whole child, there's a whole language around all this. The fundamental, whatever word you use, the fundamental idea is that schools and those organizations that work in and around schools have to pay attention to all elements of a young person's circumstances and experiences in order to meet that young person and help them thrive. And also have to pay attention to all elements of that young person's development, all of which feeds that young person's capacity to learn and succeed academically. Some might say that that's too much to take on, and I get that, but I think we've seen the alternative, and the alternative doesn't really work. Failure. It's failure for students who don't feel that sense of safety, of belonging, don't feel a real sense of possibility in their lives, and it's failure for systems that continue to produce numbers that are unacceptable. And so, you know, given all that, we think that figuring out how to really embrace this view of a comprehensive development of young people and responding to all of their needs, along with the rigor around readiness, is really the secret to continuing to progress. And we want to talk to you about all that today and hear your thoughts about how that rolls out and how that works in practice. And we'll hear from Emily, we'll hear from David about the things that they've observed and worked on, and the things they think because of the things that they've observed and worked on. And we're really eager for a rich conversation with all of you about that collection of issues that are really about how we all come together to help more young people succeed in school and be prepared to thrive in adult success. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it to Navesha, who is our Sherpa and guide for the day, and we'll take it from here. But thank you all very much for being here, and thanks to those on the phone whom we wish we could see.
Thank you, John. So I want to echo what John said. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're excited to have you here, and we think you're going to learn a lot from the experts that we have in the room. But before we get started, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping things. So if you have to use the bathroom, it's straight back towards these doors. There is a key to the men's bathroom, which is on the desk by Ms. Cynthia. And for the people on the phone, just make sure that you mute yourself during the presentation if you're not saying anything. And then also, if you do have a question for the people that are on the phone, make sure to use the chat function, and we'll make sure that we ask them to the audience, to the experts. And then anyone in the room, you can definitely chime in and ask any questions that you may have. Then another thing I just wanted to point out is that there are cards on your table, and they look like this. And so, since it is grad season, we just wanted you to take the time to write like a nice little note on this card that basically answers the question, who helped you? So tell us about a relationship in your life that helped you reach the milestone of high school graduation. And so if you can just like fill those out throughout the meeting, that would be great. and then we'll share them out on social and things like that. And for the people on the phone, we can definitely email you guys the prompts so that you can send your answers as well, and we'll share that on social. And so just to give you an outline of the agenda for today, so we'll start with the welcome and introduction so we can know who's on the phone and who's in the room. And then we're going to have a book discussion about the book Make or Break Year by Emily Krone Phillips, and Monica will facilitate that. Then we'll have a presentation about the science of how learning happens, and that'll be Dr. Kathryn Wentzel who will be speaking about that. And then we'll have another presentation by David Adams, who will talk about the practice of how learning happens and how we can integrate that into the schools and the communities. And then we're going to have a panel discussion where we'll bring all of the experts back to the front to kind of just dig deeper into this conversation and talk more about how to bridge the gap between social, emotional, and academic learning in practice and in science. And then we're going to break out into groups so we can really talk about how this can show up in your work in the future and things like that. And then we'll just have lunch and you guys can network and talk to each other. So kicking off with the introductions, we would like to go around the room. And if you could say your name, your organization, and one fun thing that you're doing at your job or something that you're super excited about, that would be great, just so we can learn more about the work that you're doing. I can start off. So my name is Navesha Noble, and I'm a manager on the Strategic Initiatives and Partnerships team. And I'm excited about a lot of different things because we have a lot of different things going on. So I'm excited about all the things that will come out from this meeting. But we're also planning other convenings as well, and I'm excited about bringing people from the community level, district level, nonprofit level, all the sectors together because we all know that we can't do this work alone. So I'm excited about that.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm Monica Kinchlow at America's Promise Alliance, and I am excited about a new body of work that America's Promise is taking on called How Learning Happens. So you'll see us using that term a lot. And I'm excited about it because one component of it is around community convenings, and so we'll be releasing a call for conveners in a few weeks to see which communities are ready to kind of dig deeper and go to the next level on how learning happens. So they might be doing it, say, in a single school or in their child welfare services office, but are they talking to each other and are they really leveraging the expertise that might be elsewhere in the community? And so I'm excited for those community convenings.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Margaret Millar. I work for the Council of Chief State School Officers. Something I'm excited about is our current board president, Secretary Pedro Rivera from Pennsylvania. His platform for the year is really exciting to us. I was just sharing with Katie, it's all around how do you support, how does a state agency, do you partner with those in your community to help you bring resources to support students around mental health, physical health, food security, and homelessness, which are areas that we have not spent a lot of time with at our organization or many state agencies have. And so it's really allowed us to build new partnerships. And a lot of what we're finding is that we're obviously not the experts in this. And so what are the resources other organizations have that we can be sharing, and what are the partnerships we can help states form on this? So looking for help. That was part of why I wanted to share that one, but I'm glad to be here.
Morning, everybody. My name is Katie Brown. I'm with Schoolhouse Connection. Our focus is on addressing student homelessness, early care, all the way through post-secondary, so through education. And one of the focuses of my work for this calendar year is creating a series of tools and convening a series of webinars that focus on chronic absenteeism and how it is experienced by students experiencing homelessness. I'm especially interested to learn about the science behind and the ways that adult relationships and school-based relationships can support chronic absenteeism. We're doing a webinar in August on mentorship and how that can improve rates of chronic absenteeism. So I'm hoping to learn a lot today.
Good morning. I'm David Adams, Director of Social Emotional Learning at the Urban Assembly. I'm excited for two things. First, I'm really excited that America's Promise has decided to take on the call and the mission for social emotional academic development. I was part of the work from ASCEN, and I was really excited to know that you guys had decided to move that work forward. I think that's really important. The second thing I would say is that we are having a symposium on May 24th at New York City around social emotional learning, and I'm excited about that because we are actively putting it together as I am here. So I'm really happy to be here, and thank you guys for the work you do.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Krone Phillips, and I'm the author of The Make or Break Year, which talks about Chicago's pretty remarkable improvement in their graduation rates. And then I'm also the communications director at the Spencer Foundation, which funds education research. And so one thing that I'm really excited about is Spencer's push. Sort of historically, we've given money to researchers and then been like, do your thing. And we're trying to partially, they hired a communications director to do this, get much more of a feel for what have people produced with that research and how can we share it with the world. So.
Hi, good morning. I'm Jillian Luckner. I'm with the After School Alliance. I'm the policy manager there. We are working to make sure that there's an accessible, affordable after-school program for every student who wants one. One thing I'm excited about in this context is in the last few years, we have been working a lot more with social emotional learning, which we, in our field, have kind of always thought of as positive youth development, but love the concept of social emotional learning. We had a brief come out last year that I brought with me, but it's our 2018 social emotional learning and after-school brief. I'm so excited to just learn from everybody in this room today and hear ways that we can keep connecting.
Good morning, I'm Kim Cook. I'm the Executive Director of the National College Access Network. We spent a lot of time thinking about that, what happens after high school graduation question. And we are jumping into a new strategic plan, so I'm very excited about the work we're about to do with school counselors, principals, and superintendents to tackle this question.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Gabatsky. I work at the National Center for Learning Disabilities, and the one thing that I'm excited about is later this summer we're going to release a larger report with a bunch of smaller pieces associated with 21st century learning for students with disabilities, and making sure that these innovative approaches are accessible to all students.
My name is Heidi Reed. I work for Turnaround for Children here in DC, and we're an organization that aims to translate a lot of the science of how learning happens, so the science of learning and development, into concrete tools and strategies that help schools support developing the whole child, and specifically in communities where children experience a lot of stress and trauma. So one of the things I'm excited about this year that I've been able to work on is we've partnered with Georgetown University, Relay Graduate School for Education, and Ed Forward on a grant where I'm running a community of practice of 25 assistant principals across sector in DC, some public schools, some public charter schools. And it's supported by Ms. Melissa Kim as part of her work and initiative and commitment to social emotional academic development. So it's been a privilege. We have like a 9-session learning series, 5 hours each session, where I just get to dive deep into the science of learning and development and these practices with assistant principals. And it's especially exciting because this is the time of year where some assistant principals have found out they're going to be principals next year. So the idea of school leaders making this a core piece of their principalship platform is just really exciting for me, and I'll get to follow 6 of those leaders into their first year as a principal next year. Really excited.
John Gompertz, America's Promise. Excited for everybody here today and looking forward to this conversation. Thank you all for being here.
Hi everyone, I'm Liz Glazer. I work also at America's Promise on the Strategic and Partnerships team. One thing I'm really excited about is I work with the team of 5 acceleration types, we call them, and their groups experience across the country. And over the last year, we've really learned that a lot of their work under the GradNation banner is intersecting a lot with the How Learning Happens work. And so I'm really excited to make those connections a little bit more clear over the next. Great.
I'm Kathryn Wentzel. I'm from the University of Maryland. I'm an educational researcher. And I would mention 2 things that I'm particularly excited about. One, I'm working on how peer relationships intersect with teacher-student relationships in positive ways to support learning and motivation in the classroom. And I think that's something that we need to think more about. I'm also editor of Educational Psychologist, and I've just put together, I think, an all-star cast of SEL scholars who are writing specifically about how SEL relates to learning in the classroom. So stay tuned, it's going to be coming out over the summer. And I think it is unique in that they're not just going to talk about social aspects, social emotional outcomes, but also how it relates to learning. So we've got folks like
talent, Regina Yang, who talks about learning development, Stephanie Jones and Mark Brackett, Mark Cowan, how we assess these things in the classroom. So I think it's going to be a nice contribution.
I'm Melissa Meller. I'm with America's Promise, and I'm excited by America's Promise's newest campaign called the Yes Project, which is focused on youth employment. And I'm particularly interested in thinking about how learning happens work and the social and emotional dimensions of learning and development really play into people's lives when they enter the workforce, and thinking about the connection between those two efforts.
And Steve Cassio, I'm with the Learning Policy Institute. One thing I'm really excited about is next week we're holding a briefing. Just had a planning call yesterday with Monica and some of the other people who are going to be on the panel to talk about the investment that have been made on the House side to try to prioritize social emotional learning and full child approaches to education in their appropriations bill. So very excited to see some of the research being recognized and put into policy. We're excited to have a lot of other organizations helping us in that work.
The Second American Promise Alliance, one of the benefits of going class is I get to be excited about everything that I heard all day. I was writing down all the things that I want to be sure that I check out. So I'm excited about today and excited about all the work.
So slight correction, Dennis is not last. We want to go to the phone and just check in quickly if there's anyone on the phone to introduce yourself and something you're excited about.
Hi, this is Christine Morin with City Year, and really excited to be a part of the conversation today. One thing that I'm excited about is some work that we're doing across several of our schools to pilot the holistic student assessment, working with the PAIR Institute. And that's a data-driven assessment that really provides a portrait of the unique strengths and challenges of each student. And I'm excited about what we're seeing in terms of changes in adult behavior in the school based on insights from students, and really bringing student voice to the forefront and thinking about how we can design environments that build on student strengths and help them succeed.
Thank you. Is there someone else on the phone?
Hi, this is Matt from Civic, which is right around the corner from where you're all sitting. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. Something that I'm really excited about is 2 years ago, Civic produced a report called Ready to Lead, which took the temperature of principals' opinions on social emotional learning and how they're implementing social emotional learning. And we are partnering with Hart Research Associates and Castle out in Chicago to do a second iteration of that survey and see if feelings have changed and just kind of gauge implementation of systematic social emotional learning with principals in schools throughout the country. So I'm excited about everything that you all are doing as well. So thanks for having me on the line.
Hi there, this is Dan Hatfield from Tufts University. I'm a research assistant professor in the School of Nutrition here. So I'm not an education researcher, but I do a lot of work in school settings. So I'm really interested in the conversation today about where social and emotional learning might intersect with some of the work that I do around promoting physical activity and healthy eating. One project I'm working on right now that I'm really excited about is a new NIH-funded intervention study where we're trying to promote physical literacy in young people. So that's sort of the combination of confidence, competence, and motivation to enable kids to be physically active for life.
Good morning. My name is Carrie Webb. I work with the Jobs for America's Graduates program, and I am excited about an initiative we have launched called the JAG Advantage, what gives our students that we work with in high schools across the country the advantage of being a part of our program. And we have incorporated project-based learning as our primary teaching strategy to deliver our competencies to the young people. We have wrapped around trauma-informed care practices to promote resiliency within our learners. And we have also incorporated the third element to this, which is employer engagement, how we engage with employers to help connect our young people to lifelong learning and careers that lead to promising jobs in their future.
Hi, this is Tiffany Miller calling from Communities in Schools. I am excited to be included in the conversation and to learn about all of the work that all of our other partners and friends are doing. At Communities in Schools, we are launching our own, well, we're digging deeper into some of our own developmental relationship work. So I am looking forward to seeing how our assessment around that, developmental relationships, turns out.
I think there's a couple more people on the phone, so I think, did Valerie go already? Valerie? Okay. Is there anyone else that didn't introduce themselves?
Good morning, everyone. My name is, oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, my name is Bonnie Solomon. I am with Child Trends. I work, I'm a research scientist with our education team, and I'm so happy to be joining you all. One thing that I'm really excited about, we have a lot of exciting projects going on right now, but one that's just getting started is essentially a needs assessment, a needs and resources assessment, looking into chronic absenteeism in DC. We're partnering with DC Public Schools and Children's National Health System and a couple of other agencies and organizations to understand the health-related drivers of chronic absenteeism, and we're thinking really broadly about health in that way, and how to better engage healthcare providers in chronic absenteeism reduction efforts that has not really deliberately been done much in the past, and yet they are a really important player in, you know, the identification and management of lots of conditions that folks are dealing with, and so we're excited to dig into that.
Hey everyone, this is Nico Connolly from America's Promise Alliance. I work on our Every School Healthy campaign, and one thing I'm really excited about is a convening we are doing this summer in Boston that will actually bring together the 6 communities we're working with on the Every School Healthy campaign, and some of our national partners on that campaign, like Communities in Schools and Turnaround and Child Obesity 180. And each of those communities is really focused on creating school environments that support the whole child and supporting their schools in doing that. And one thing that really excites me about the project is that all 6 of those communities are focusing on how to engage young people in innovative and different ways to tackle some of those obstacles to well-being that young people are facing in their schools and in their communities. So I'm looking forward to the conversation here.
Okay, I think that's everyone on the phone, so thank you. So now we're going to kick it off to Monica and Emily to talk about the make or break year.
Thanks, Navisha. Thanks to everyone on the phone. Just a quick reminder to mute yourself until we're at the Q&A, and then we do invite your questions. So for everyone in the room, and I wish you could see her on the phone, I'm very excited to welcome Emily Krone Phillips here at America's Promise. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you.
Welcome, everyone else. I am going to put this up. This is my rain-soaked, coffee-stained copy of The Make or Break Year. I read it. It was with me every morning on my commute here into DC. And
I'm like seeing coffee stain, like that's the most honor I could have.
I spilled my coffee. That's how much it was with me. It's a remarkable book. So I'm very excited to have this time with Emily. And I spent so much time reading it, and I had this notes page on my phone, and I was like documenting pages, because the way Emily writes is it's accessible. It's not just, you know, it's not wonky. I wasn't reading a textbook, which was such a great relief in my life because I've been in school for too long. It's a story about many things. It's about high school generally, and the ways in which the 9th grade year can trick or trap kids, but also how it can catch and support kids. The book is an illustration of the impact that high school can have on a young person. But it's also a story about specific young people, like David, Jakia, and Marcus. And it's a story about a few adults, like Melissa Roderick, Karen Baran, Pam Glynn, and Maurice Swinney. The last few are school leaders. And it's even about people like Mayor Rahm Emanuel and the many CEOs of Chicago Public Schools. And it's a story about two high schools in Chicago, Tilden and Hancock. And for those of you in the room, there's a page at the end of the packet in front of you with some current data about these schools. But most importantly, the make or break here is about adults and how they interact with each other, and also how they interact on behalf and for young people. And all of those interactions are with a goal in mind to change the odds, not just for those kids, but for educational success in general. So for those of us who are in the classroom, Emily writes for us. And for young people living in challenging circumstances, Emily writes for them as well. And for an education system that we're all working in that's hell-bent both on changing somehow and staying the same, Emily writes that story too. So we're going to spend a few minutes up here talking about the book, and then we'll open it up for questions. So stay with us. If you have questions on the phone, please go ahead and feel free to enter them in the chat function. Navisha's watching that, and we'll get started here. So Emily, thanks again for being here.
Thank you for that introduction. That was lovely.
I'm telling you,
Really
those coffee stains are real. I dropped coffee on it. So in this book, at its crux, is this metric called the Freshman on Track metric. And it came out of the University of Chicago Consortium as an indicator to measure the success of individuals in their 9th grade year. But it didn't stay in academia, it came to schools. So before we dive into the Freshman on Track, what it really spurred, because that's really the crux of the story that you tell, what is the Freshman on Track metric? And how does it reflect a bridge between research and practice?
So the Freshman on Track indicator was developed at University of Chicago at a consortium on Chicago School of Research, where I used to be the communications director, so this is how I got involved in this story. And it was basically to measure basic progress that 9th graders were making. And it was created, the consortium studies Chicago Public Schools, and their mission is to use that research to improve Chicago Public Schools. And so they, unlike a lot of researchers who are very focused on specific topics, they're very focused on a specific place. And work iteratively over time. Sometimes we called each other, like, we called ourselves like a critical friend. Sometimes we called ourselves like the institutional memory of Chicago Public Schools, because regimes came and went, but the consortium was there, looking at data, keeping track of what was going on. So they developed this metric because 8th grade, and in Chicago in case there was a number of elementary schools who were saying, we don't really know what happens to our 9th graders, you know, when they get to high school. And we don't really find out anything about how our kids have done until they take tests their junior year. And so we have really no way of measuring how we're doing. So the consortium said, okay, well, a really basic way of keeping track of that would be to see how many courses freshmen fail. And what they came over a period of time to find out was that that metric, which they started to call the Freshman on Track metric, was actually more predictive of whether or not students graduate than just about anything else you can measure about a kid. So students are considered on track if they fail no more than one core course, and if they have enough credits to go on to sophomore year at the end of their freshman year. And that was more predictive of graduation than race, than family income, than 8th grade test scores. In fact, it was more predictive than everything combined. And this completely changed people's perceptions of how to attack the dropout problem, and also why kids drop out, because there was sort of this perception, A, that you could not predict who would drop out, and that was not true. And then B, that it was something that was very much outside of the control of schools. Crime, family income, what happened before your 8th grade test score, so how you were doing before you ever even got to high school. And what this showed was that, no, actually, if you can keep students on track in their freshman year, they will almost always graduate. And what subsequent research has found out is that not only is it very predictive of high school graduation, but it's also predictive of college success.
All right, so we're talking about credit accumulation and course failure in the 9th grade year. That's what freshman on track is. So you can imagine being a teacher, being a principal in these Chicago schools, and that's the data you get. So what do you do with it, right? I think that's really the most interesting thing here. But before we dive into that, you heard the backgrounds of everyone on the phone and in the room. And I know we can't see each other, and I'm not going to make any guesses about ages, but we've all been doing this for a while. We've been in education. We've been talking to young people or educators for a long time, and a lot of teachers often say fads. Things come and go in education. And over the last couple decades, a lot of accountability-based reform has come through schools, and it's brought with it a lot of very specific things that need to happen. There's been a huge focus on college for all. Everyone's got to be ready for college reform. But a lot of them have failed, and especially in urban education, a lot of them have not reached scale as intended. You talk about this a lot in the beginning of your book, about why some of those failed and why Freshman on Track is actually quite different. So help us understand what it was happening at the same time. Freshman on Track was happening at the same time as NCLB and ESSA and Race to the Top and School Improvement Grants. Tell us a little bit about what's different.
Right, so I think actually I like this question because it's really the reason I wrote this book. So 2015, 2016, I forget how long it took to write this book, but when I was communications director, it was clear that something had happened in Chicago. Graduation rates had gone up. People were being held accountable for freshman on track rates, and the freshman on track rate had just skyrocketed. It had gone from 50s for many, many years to the latest, I think, is 89%. So, I mean, it was just really pretty remarkable improvement, and we had done some more research showing that that kids who were on track were actually staying on track and graduating, and there was all these good things happening. And so people were coming to the consortium and saying, okay, well, what happened? And it felt like there was a lot of potentially bad things that could happen with that information, right? Because we knew sort of something had happened, we knew the research, we didn't really know how that research had been translated into practice, and we had some ideas, but there was sort of this fear that people were going to say, okay, we're just going to do on track. And so we're going to put freshmen on track on an accountability framework, and then we've done on track, and then our graduation rates will improve, and then there wouldn't be that improvement, and everyone would say, oh, freshmen on track doesn't work. And so what I felt really needed to happen was somebody needed to write the book of, like, not just the 9th grade indicator, but what is this story of how this change happened? And how does that look different than other reforms? So anyway, that's sort of the history behind writing this book. So many reforms, and Tony Bragg, some of you are probably familiar with his work on improvement, but he talks about solutionitis, and I think that's a great way of talking about reform. And I start the book actually with talking about how the first iteration of Freshmen on Track in Chicago really didn't work, and it was sort of the definition of solutionitis. So what happened was this research had come out of the consortium saying 9th grade is important, and at the same time there was this feeling that the elementary schools in Chicago were kind of getting better, but the high schools were really, really bad. And so Paul Vallis, way back in the Paul Vallis era in Chicago in the 90s, convened this task force and of all the sort of movers and shakers and people who worked in schools in various capacities, probably like all the different types of people who are around this table. And okay, everybody make some recommendations. So everybody went back and had their own sort of pet program, and most of the programs were like good ideas. When I read through the list of ideas that people came up with, none of them were bad ideas. It was advisories, it was freshman academies, it was more gym, it was more this, I mean, it was like everything you can possibly imagine that would come up with, like, from people who are good-hearted and worked in schools and thought about kids' well-being. And so there was like 30 recommendations. They said, let's do them all, and let's do them all in like 6 months, and everybody has to do them, and it was what you would expect, like a pretty spectacular failure. People were really, really frustrated because they hadn't. First, people were mad because they hadn't been part of the process. People were mad because it didn't really take into account at all the reality of their schools. Just like a teeny example that I go into in the book is, and cut me off, I'm like going on way too long with all of this stuff, but is they said, okay, but let's do advisories. Well, there wasn't time in the day to do advisories, and so the union had to vote to do advisories, and then they all voted against it because they didn't really like their principals, and they were really mad about all sorts of different things that were going on in the working conditions. So they voted no, and then there was a fight. So it was like that kind of stuff all day long.
And that's what makes people wary, right? So what's different, though, about Freshmen on Track? I think part of the language you use is it solves for the politics of collective action.
Right. So with Freshmen on Track, there was an accountability piece, and then there was a huge education campaign taken on by the consortium, by the district, where they spent a tremendous amount of time convincing people that this metric mattered and that this was something that actually, if you focused on, good things could happen for kids. And people trusted some of the people in the district who were doing that work, and they trusted the consortium as well. So people started saying, okay, this is actually something that matters, not just because we're being held accountable for it, but also because this might actually be a way to address something that we know matters for kids, which is graduating from high school. So I think that was the first step. And then the second step was that people were given a lot of latitude to figure out what was the best way to address this issue of ninth grade in their own schools. So they weren't told do advisories. They were told look at data, make a plan, see if that plan is working, and if it's not, adjust course. And they were given also sort of treated as professionals capable of coming up with their own solutions to this issue. So that was the second piece of it. The third piece of it was they were given a lot of help by outside organizations to look at the data that they were being given and to make sense of it and to come together. And so they got a lot of support around looking at this data. And then they worked across schools to share information. So schools were creating their own teams to look at these data, but then they were also meeting with other schools to learn from other schools.
Yeah. So I think what you just helped do is actually describe the infrastructure, right? The supportive network structure that's helping to enable these kinds of behaviors. Could you talk a little bit about the interactions, the relationships that having that infrastructure and structure helped create? Because I think part of what's tricky about a lot of our work, often at national organizations, is it's hard to understand or get that insight into how people are talking to each other about kids, or how are people talking to each other about their educational practice. And what I find so valuable about the book is you actually, sometimes you feel like you might be reading a novel for a moment because you're actually writing the words that people say to each other. A child doesn't come to school for 5 days. Well, what conversation does that trigger among the adults in the room? So could you talk a little bit about the role of really those one-to-one relationships within the structure?
So I would say that Freshmen on Track worked because it changed relationships between students and teachers. It changed relationships among teachers. It changed relationships among practitioners from school to school. So it sort of changed all these different relationships at all these different levels. The biggest change was that when people started looking at these data, they were looking at them as teams in school. And you're right, I think the conversations that people were having were some of my favorite parts because I felt like I was in the middle of the novel as people were working together to try to get to the root of why are we seeing this pattern? And so it was like a mystery that was being unraveled every time they got together to try to figure it out. And so teams of teachers would be looking at data and they would see, okay, Alex is failing this class. Now, in the past, before Freshmen on Track in Chicago, if anyone even noticed that Alex was failing this class, they might say, okay, you need to go to math tutoring because you obviously are lacking some basic math skills. Freshmen on Track made the discussion much more complex. So people would look at these data and say, okay, he's failing this class. And you'd say, okay, let's see, is he failing it? Is he here or not? That's one of the first questions that they would always ask. Like, is he in this class or not? Is this an absences problem or not? Okay, he's here every day. Well, what does this say about Alex? He's here every day. He wants to learn this material. He's showing up. Like, there's a level of engagement here. So that flips it already, the discussion that you're having about a kid, because instead of thinking about it as like he's failing and it's a problem, you can think of it as like, okay, he's showing up every day. He wants. There's something that he's trying to get out of this class. Then somebody might say, well, I have Alex in English, and actually in English he's getting a B in my class. And so that further complicates the discussion, right? Because instead of saying, this is just a kid who, isn't a good student, you're like, well, what's happening in English that he's doing great and not happening in math? And then somebody might say, well, does it seem like it's like an organizational problem? Is he not turning in his work, or is it a skills problem? Like, is he missing some basic skill? Does he not understand fractions, or is he, And sometimes the answer would be, yeah, he really just doesn't understand fractions. But sometimes the answer would be, well, he's missing every Thursday and Friday because he's dropping off his younger brother at his school. Or sometimes the answer would be, like one of my favorite ones that I witnessed of all time, well, he's in love. And, like, it was basically like, he was doing fine. You know what? That's when he started dating XYZ, And so it was these kinds of conversations where you're looking at data and there's always sort of this feeling that data is so impersonal, but I saw these incredibly personal stories come out of these data because of the way that these conversations are structured.
Yeah, it's really, I can't emphasize enough. There's coffee and rain on this book for a reason. I was reading this, I'm like, people really do this in schools? Because I'll be honest, I didn't work in a school that did this or had these conversations. So it's really remarkable. So I'm again, folks in the room have this handout, and I hope we can share it with folks on the phone as well. The data from these schools obviously has changed over the years and is actually really different now because Hancock shifted from being open enrollment to selective enrollment. And so the student bodies in these schools are what policy people would describe as high needs. So we're one school, Tilden, 76, the graduation rate right now, 76%, 95% of the students are low income, 24% are students with disabilities, and 28% are homeless. And when you spoke about Tilden's progress with Freshmen on Track, you're right, it took an array of staff and nonprofit organizations to address all of the specific needs. One of the things that stood out the most about these programs, but they were not strictly or even primarily focused on teaching content or building academic skills. Rather, they were focused on ensuring that students exhibited the type of academic behavior, that was likely to make them successful in school. And then later, you're talking with Swinney, the Tilden principal, about this is after finding out that he's losing federal funds and that the district's choice system was essentially going to be concentrating many high-need students into his school. And he said, we know who our kids are. There could be an advantage to having high-needs kids in smaller schools in some places, but if they're going to be in one place, we also need to make sure that they have what they need. It's about equity. It really is. One of the things, it's really intense. And someone in my office in a lovingly way laughed when I said that it made me cry when I read this, because I have to sort of emphasize this is in the last 20 pages of the book, and so or so. And so you've read all this, you're following along with these schools, and then you get this like heartbreaking blow of he's going to lose funding to be able to provide the supports that he's been providing these kids for years, and you know, it just leaves you with this sense of, oh, if you can't pay for the individuals who are going to make those relationships happen, what do you do? It's a powerful build-up, actually, to that point. But where I'm headed with this is this notion that there are some naysayers that say, well, if you're going to talk about all these other things, like, well, why does a teacher need to know this kid is in love? It's about whether or not they're passing courses and mastering the content, that academic rigor piece. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how this is a process that supports equity, where how the equity manifested in these schools, based on these conversations that you just described, but also this balance of it isn't just purely academic, just get them what they need in these other facets of what learning requires.
Right. I mean, I think people act as if those two things are separate, and they're so clearly tied together. Having what you need from an emotional and relational standpoint is what allows you to learn. And I always think back to this one interview that I did, and I don't even think it's in the book, but it was with the head of this organization called Youth Guidance, and they have some really awesome programs, including the Becoming a Man program, which has gotten a lot of attention. And she's been working in Chicago schools forever. And she said when she started, they had so much trouble that all of her stuff is social emotional work. And she said, we couldn't get anyone's attention. Like, nobody wanted us in their school. She said, you know, there was like this feeling of, we do our thing, you can do yours, it's separate. And one of the things she talked about was that when people started being held accountable for both their freshman on track rates, but more generally just for like learning outcomes, people started being like, well, how can we possibly do this alone? There's all these different reasons, there's all these social emotional aspects of it that also need to be attended to if people can learn. And that's when people started asking them in. So it was like the practitioners themselves recognized that there was no way to get to the learning if you weren't paying attention to the whole kid. And so I just thought that was so interesting as somebody who had seen this evolution happen in Chicago.
It's really maybe just one more question. I have a feeling we've got some good thoughts from the audience for the discussion. At America's Promise, we focus a lot on youth voice, and we really believe that implementation of what the adults are interested in doing will have a better shot at success if it's informed by the lived experience of young people. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I think you tell some really powerful stories about the young people. What role did youth voice and youth experience play in implementing and seeing the success of Freshman on Track?
Yeah, when you sent me that question, I had to think about it for a little bit, because part of me was like, well, the whole thing is about youth voice, because Freshman on Track is really an effort to sort of get to know kids better. But then the more I thought about it, when you sort of said it didn't show up until Chapter 7, I was like, well, that's a good point, because there's a lot of schools, because schools had a lot of latitude to figure out how they wanted to implement it, different schools had more or less intention around including voice. And so Maurice Sweeney at Tilden was very intentional about that. And he asked for feedback a lot from students. And, you know, even in a school where they spent a lot of time thinking about what kids wanted, it was kind of remarkable, some of these meetings. The adults in the room heard some things they didn't want to hear from students because they thought they were doing sort of all they could do. And I can remember this one meeting where Maurice had brought together all the kids who had been off track essentially who came into high school the most at risk and had gotten the worst grades, had seemed like they were going to be at risk of being off track freshman year, but they'd all ended the first semester on track. So he wanted to find out, well, what had happened at Tilden that had made them more successful as ninth graders than as eighth graders, which is really flipping the common pattern of places. And so it sort of seemed like it was going to be a really nice celebratory discussion, and for most part, people were saying that they felt much more supported in eighth grade. But then there was a lot of people who also who wanted more, and they had one of the counselors of the school who was really overworked and had to spend a lot of his time doing also college counseling. He was helping to facilitate the discussion, and one of the students said, "We need a counselor," and he was like, "Oh, I am the counselor," and she's like, "Well, we've seen you," and a lot of the kids started saying, "Yeah, we've never seen you. You don't," and he's kind of fumbling. Well, I spend a lot of time with seniors. We need you too. And so, it's really incredible because I think, and that's, he walked out of there and I could tell he was feeling really defensive because he felt like he had more on his plate than he could handle. But he also, that sort of shifted in him saying, I need to spend more time thinking about how to reach out to freshmen and make friends. So I think it's so important.
Thank you. This will be a little bit of a segue into the discussion period. So for those of you who have questions, please have them ready. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the resources it takes, or a little bit at a brass tacks level. What are the resources, whether it's human, financial, time, that it takes to make Freshmen on Track happen? And if you could speak a little bit to kind of harkening back to what we talked about before about ed reform, having trouble getting to scale, is there something about Freshmen on Track that makes it more transferable to other places, like another school or another district?
Okay, those are two.
They are different questions.
I'll say the first one about the resources. So I think you need time, and that's a really precious resource in schools. And a lot of the things that happened from an administrative level in Chicago that sort of threatened the success of Freshmen on Track was about taking people's time to get together and just meet and discuss. And so figuring out a way to give people really the time to collaborate is huge. And then the accountability piece, really, it mattered, and not just it mattered that people who were in charge were saying, this matters, and we need to be focused on this. And, whether that accountability is punitive or characteristic or whatever, it did matter that there were people saying, this really matters, and you need to focus on this, it will be rewarded for focusing on this. And then the third piece was, just having the resources to have the different services in place. So I think Freshmen on Track, I say in the book, it's a base measure of how well your students are being supported. Really base, like low level, not like this is what we're aiming for, but at the very least, they need to have this level of support to not fail. And it takes a lot of resources in some places. So you do need to have the resources to be able to have a counselor, to have somebody who can be focused on Freshmen on Track. Some schools they have that, and some schools they didn't, but schools where they did. And then the data piece, to be able to be getting regular cycles, your students to see what their grades are, what their attendance is, to have the capacity to be able to analyze that and to pull those grades regularly. Any final thoughts on replication or? Yeah. So I'm very skeptical of sort of this idea of like what works and being able to scale a program or a policy. I think it's difficult to scale relationships. At the same time, I think if you put certain certain things in place that makes it more likely that people will be able to work together and have success. That's what spreads things, because, you know, I always talk about freshman on track wasn't a diet, it was lifestyle change. And when people started getting together to work on data and they started seeing that data move and they started seeing kids' lives change as a result, people would be like, I could never go back to doing my work the way I used to do it. And that's a completely different thing. And that's how you, I think, create sustainable change. Because once you see those relationships shift, you're not going to go back to not doing freshman on track.
Yeah, thank you. This was great. I want to see if there are questions in this room and on the phone. I don't think it's come through the chat yet. There are lots of other questions I have here, so I could keep going, but I do want to make sure that if there's anything that kind of piqued your interest or curious to hear more about. Yeah.
Okay. As you were describing the initiative and what made it different from previous efforts, you did a really good job of like laying out, well, there was the accountability, then they all had latitude, like you laid out almost like the conditions that made it different. And then I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about the actual like components of the implementation in terms of like, were there resources, guidance, models, coaching as part of that? So you mentioned the discussions that teachers or educators were having about their kids were more complex. Like they weren't just what academic skill are they missing, but it was all these other things. So did they have guidance in terms of suggested protocols for these conversations, discussion questions, things to consider, or in general, did you notice like, you know, like, I don't know, guardrails or recommendations for meet this many times for this amount of kids with these types of adults? Here's how it can intersect with your tier 2, tier 3 systems for support, like getting into the nitty gritty.
Sure. So I would just, I'll also put on in a plug. So one of the partner organizations that really sort of did what you're describing is called the Network for College Success. And they're also Network for College Success, and they're located at the University of Chicago. And so they sort of partnered with the consortium, and they built this over time. So when Freshmen on Track started, the approach that most schools took was they had one person who was in charge of Freshmen on Track, and that person ran around like a crazy person and tried to help all the kids who were failing. And
in one school?
Yeah, like each school. Yeah, like each school would sort of have their designated Freshman on Track person. And what people were finding was like that was fine if you had 5 kids who were failing, but if you had 200 kids who were failing, which a lot of schools did, that wasn't unrealistic, then what are you going to do? And so the Network for College Success actually started working on this problem and started developing some protocols. And really what they found was that the team approach was the most effective. And one of their strength is actually facilitation. So what they were doing was teaching schools how to do this facilitation and how to have a good meeting. And so, yes, they gave a lot of protocols. And so my plug would be that the Network for College Success has a Freshman Success Institute every year where people can go and learn some of these things. And they also online, I think their website is like On Track something. I don't know, Google it. Google Freshman on Track, University of Chicago, and you'll get, and they have all these resources too. So I think the resources themselves, like on their own, I'm a little skeptical that you can just sort of take them and dump them in. But there was like a huge coaching component of this. And the schools that had the most successful Freshmen on Track basically interacted in one way or the other with Network for College Success.
Curious to know what the ripple effects were like in the larger district. So how did the elementary schools then take on some responsibility for preparing those kids, knowing that if they don't pass 9th grade algebra, there's a trajectory, or maybe take on those summer programs in the 8th and 9th grade transition year to make sure that even before they get into 9th grade, they're feeling that cohort.
So there's a few things. One is that Chicago is really complicated because the way that the choice system works, there isn't any kind of feeder pattern. So it's really, really challenging to feel sort of ownership over over that transition, because what was happening was your 8th graders might be going to 40 or 50 different high schools. And so helping kids make that transition. So really what Freshmen on Track sort of did was say, it also helped people realize that a lot of these kids have been doing like just fine until they got to freshman year. And so the transition was a lot of the problem for a lot of these students. That said, there are a few things. A lot of schools did start creating something called Summer Bridge to actually make that transition more smooth, and so kids were in the school for a few weeks beforehand, and they did all sorts of summer programming, and that seemed to actually really be effective in certain schools and really helpful. I think there were ripple effects all over the district, because one of the things that happened was that a lot of the principals who had started out working on this and got really good at it ended up taking leadership roles in the district in various capacities. In fact, Marie Sweeney is one of the main characters in the book, is now the chief equity officer in the district. But that happened like throughout. And so some of the things that people were working on around teams and networks, they worked with the Network of College Success, and then they tried to bring that network approach when they came to the district. And so people started meeting, as networks to work on other problems. One of the things that people throughout the district are working on right now is Bees Are Better, so trying to use the same approach that they use to prevent failures to get kids to be college ready.
I'm curious, speaking of college, whether you've seen, Kim, I wonder, is there a corollary effort to help kids who are struggling to succeed in college, and some of these same principles apply to kids who, get to college? We encourage them to go to college, but we know that the graduation rates are low in general, particularly low for kids who have complicated backgrounds.
I'll talk about it, but then I'd love to hear your approach too. I think the issues are really similar in a lot of ways. In fact, the researcher who did the original Freshman on Track research, when she couldn't find any other research on the transition from 8th to 9th grade, she looked at the research on the transition to college, and that informed a lot of her understanding of the transition from 8th to 9th, because so much of it is around the reason why it's such a fraught time for kids, because they are figuring out their identity and whether or not they belong, and if you fail, you feel like you don't belong. So there's a really important corollary when you get to college. Do you feel like you belong? Do you feel like this is, if you work hard, you'll succeed? You feel part of the academic community, all of those different parts. In Chicago, people who worked on some of the Freshmen on Track stuff are now working to help city colleges and local colleges do some of that same work. National Louis, which is a teacher's college in Chicago, had put in place a lot of the same systems, Freshmen on Track, for their freshmen, because they have this rock star woman who worked at the high school level on it. So yes, I mean, and they're seeing huge improvements in their cohort retention rate freshman year.
I would echo many of Emily's comments. We see that, and I'm thinking a lot about On Track and readiness to do college work. I was really interested in the data from the two schools that you shared, that even in the selective enrollment high school, there was significant 81% need for remediation. So
I did want to make one point about that.
Talk
Data.
about that.
Those kids are not the selective enrollment kids who are in that data, because they were going year by year, and so those kids hadn't gotten to the junior year to be taking the ACT. So I think that data will look really different in a year or two. So those were the non-selective enrollment kids. But anyway, go on.
The so that's good news, right? But generally, this readiness issue matters, that, getting students across the graduation stage is important and a milestone, but are they ready to take next steps? Is a very important question that we do a lot with, particularly looking at remediation. So we'd like to focus a lot on having students ready for college level work when they get there. So they don't fritter away financial aid dollars and time, which is demoralizing to not be earning credit, to feel like you're going to college but not earning credit, or that you didn't belong because you weren't prepared. I love the Chicago conversation here too, because Chicago is one of the rare districts where principals are held accountable for their secondary outcomes. And that's unique in this country, and something we'd like to see be a lot less unique. And then certainly echoing all of anything that you say about ninth grade and freshmen in high school probably applies to freshmen in college, about the importance of advising and guidance and navigating this new world that has even less support and more emphasis on independent learning. Now you're in college. Quick thoughts.
So I was interested in this idea of ninth grade as the crucial year.
The make or break year.
Make or break year. Put that on a book title. And I think in our own kind of data we're looking at in New York, one of the things I noticed is that our suspensions tend to be the highest in ninth grade. They start to then taper off in 10th, 11th. We've been thinking about that. We got some hands from the Research Alliance and NYU on perceptions of trust. They tend to be very low in ninth grade and start to kind of get up again. So I was just interested in just like this intersection between the transition 8th to ninth grade, some of the school systems that are, like our schools would say, we need to, once they figure out what the rules are, and we're working on that, right, through suspensions or through hopefully more effective approaches to expectations, they get on track. But I wanted to think about your kind of intersections between these discipline kind of concerns, some of the school culture and climate connections, and some academic progress in terms of credit recognition.
So the Research Alliance, with the consortium, works closely with them, so they're great partners to have. So I always think about this story of this one principal who kept, one of the charts from the consortium showed the likelihood of graduating based on your freshman year absences, and it's basically just like just a huge steep decline for each additional week of absence your freshman year. The chances of graduating go down precipitously. And so she kept this chart on her computer and looked at it every time she decided whether or not she was going to suspend a kid. She would say, is it worth, was the infraction worth decreasing this kid's likelihood of graduating by 20 percentage points? And she'd be like, no. And then she would figure out like another way to sort of, so I think that's one thing I would say. One of the things, the other piece of this is that we haven't really touched on, and I'm sure we'll have much more to say about this than I have, but there's some things going on with the teenage brain when you're 14 years old that really have to be acknowledged. So it's not just this transition, it's also like you've got some biology going on there. And in Chicago, this sort of recognition that you don't make great choices sometimes when you're 14, and if this year is this consequential for kids, then you better make some allowances for the fact that these kids are 14. Has permeated enough that teachers will literally say in conversations like, your cerebral cortex is not fully formed. Like you make terrible decisions, and like I will not let you do that. Exactly. And this work has completely changed how I'm going to parent my 14-year-old. Like for sure. I mean, my kids are going to stink for them. Like it's going to be the worst because like it really made me recognize reading the brain research and stuff like. They need so much support and second chances at this time in your life. Like your brain is not fully formed; it's just not. And those are chances that like middle class kids get, right? Like middle class kids get. So again, coming back to the equity piece, like it's just so important that you're not being treated when kids are 14.
I've been struggling to figure out how to frame my question, and I'm sure I could do it a lot better if I had actually read your book, so I apologize. But as I've mentioned at the beginning, we're Schoolhouse Connection. Our focus is on students experiencing homelessness. So I'm especially intrigued to read more about this particular school that had a significantly high homeless student rate. And I also mentioned that part of the focus of our work this year is chronic absenteeism, and the more conversations that I have with practitioners who are interested in addressing chronic absenteeism, the more the word relationship comes up in conversation, and pretty much the collective response is it's all about relationship, and that's how we're going to help these students get to school and stay in school. And I think the implication is usually a one-on-one relationship with a mentor, and that's obviously really resource intensive, but what you described seems to be more of a culture shift at the school that sort of creates like a relationship with all of the adults, with the practitioners, with the administrators, and I can't quite tell if that's less or more resource intensive, and I'd love it if you could speak to that and how you saw that happen, how you saw that unfold, and what the effect of that was.
So I think there's two pieces of that. People looked at the data to figure out what was going on with individual kids, but they also looked at the data to figure out school-wide what was going on. And so I think when you're talking about the culture shift, there was a culture shift in terms of, okay, if 80% of our kids are failing first period, say, like what do we need to do as a school to figure out how to help kids get to first period? Or if 50% of kids are failing this one teacher's class, like there might be something going on with this one teacher. And so when you have a school that's dedicated, and I think the other part of it is this school a place kids want to be, right? And so Pam Glenn at Hancock, which is one of the schools that I focused on, she was awesome at doing this, at making school a place kids wanted to be. I mean, and kids talked about it all the time, the difference when Miss Glenn came in. Because before Miss Glenn, like, I didn't really want to be at school, and now I want to be at school all the time. And part of that was about, she's an artist and an art teacher, and so she, and an English teacher, but she put in place, like, these art programs that were awesome. She put in place a gardening club. She put in place school dances, all sorts of things that made kids just want to be part of it. She started putting in back assemblies. They stopped assemblies because at one point people had thrown coins during an assembly or something, like 3 years earlier, and they were like, never have an assembly again. And she was like, no, we can have an assembly and there will be no coin throwing. And like, she managed to do that. So, and changing the culture of like security guards, right? Like, our security guards like making you feel like crap when you come in the building? Like, this is a personal story, but there was one school when I was an education reporter that I remember going into, and when I started as an education reporter, 23, so I kind of looked like I could still be in high school, and I was kind of dressed maybe like I was inappropriately in high school. And I came into the building, and I remember feeling like being yelled at 5 or 6 times in the time that I was in the building reporting. And I remember walking out and just being like, feeling horrible, like just horrible. And I was like, this is what the kids are experiencing every day. They're being yelled at all day long. Like, this is public. Where are you going? And then there's a different orientation. And Miss Glenn she did all this training of the people who greeted people, the security guards, the office staff, to be like, when parents came in, hello, it's so nice to see you. How can I help you? I mean, that, like, so yes, so there's things you can scale, for sure. And then there's also just that relationship piece that's really hard to substitute for, the one-on-one. So I think it's kind of cool.
So Katie, I just wanted to say, like, our Center for Promise is not, I don't think there's anybody from the center on, but they've looked a lot at this and talked to young people a lot about this. And what they come away with is the mentor-hero relationship is not actually what kids need. What kids need is a web of supportive relationships, which also makes it much easier for all of us to figure out a way to participate in that if you don't have the entire weight of the thing resting on you. So, and I think it can make it also easier for school. What Emily's describing is, oh, there's a team of people who are responsible for this group of students, and none of us is singularly responsible, but we're all collectively responsible. So I think I love mentoring, and I think it's fantastic. I just also think that the world has told us how many people are really willing to raise their hand to be a full-on mentor, and there are lots of adults in these schools, and how can we help those create the circumstances in which those adults can be part of a web of support.
Emily, thank you so much. This was wonderful, and I know we'll see you again in a little bit on the full panel at the end of our meeting.
Thanks, everyone.
We'll take a 5-minute break, is that fair? And then we'll rejoin, and we'll hear from David Adams and Dr. Kathryn. Restrooms, if you haven't been in our office, are just across the elevator bay.
Can I get your copy?
Yeah, absolutely. Folks on the phone, we're just going to mute you for now so you don't hear all the chatter, but we'll rejoin in 5 minutes.
Okay, we're going to get started again. So now the next part of the meeting will be Dr. Kathryn Wentzel, who will be talking about student relationships during the adolescent years. So I'll let her take it away.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here. I guess what I'm going to do is provide you with a brief and broad overview of the research on teacher-student relationships. We certainly can't cover the whole science of learning in adolescence, but I think what goes on between the teacher and student is especially important for understanding that process. So I'm going to touch on why these relationships are important, what they look like both to teachers and to adolescents, and what are some of the processes that we've uncovered that explain the influence of these relationships on adolescent outcomes. So to start out with, I wanted to talk about why these relationships are important and the different types of outcomes that are related to positive teacher-student relationships. There's a broad range of studies that are out there. Some are longitudinal, some are experimental, some are qualitative. But I think what's important to know is that they all come together to really validate the fact that these relationships are indeed important. And they're related to different kinds of outcomes. So they're related to academic outcomes, which is something that we absolutely want it to happen. And in particular, we know that teacher-student relationships have a very strong motivational component to them. So students who enjoy positive relationships tend to have more positive attitudes and values towards academics. They have higher levels of self-efficacy and involvement, engagement in the classroom. They set more positive goals. They pursue more positive goals. And they also tend to get higher grades and test scores. So it does seem to relate to those indicators that we like to see as well. In addition, more immediate, I think, to the relationship are a range of social and emotional outcomes. We know that during adolescence, students who enjoy these positive teacher-student relationships are more likely to engage in prosocial interactions with teachers and with their peers. They're more cooperative, they're more helpful. They share, they engage in positive forms of classroom behavior. They also enjoy more positive peer relationships. They're accepted by their peers, they're liked by their peers, and they tend to form, dyadic friendships more easily than kids who do not. They experience a more positive sense of belongingness. They express beliefs that they feel safe and secure in their classrooms, and that they're welcome. It's a welcoming place. They want to be there, which, of course, is an important component of learning. And related to that is a sense of positive emotional well-being. They just feel good about themselves. And finally, we don't often think about this, but Emily touched upon this in discussing her experiences, is that these relationships also create a more positive academic climate at the classroom and school level. So it's not just something that happens between individual teachers and an individual student, but when these relationships are in place, they're much more likely to see communities of care in schools. People are working together cooperatively and wanting to improve the whole school climate. There are greater opportunities to learn, not only within individual classrooms, but across the school setting. And positive peer relationships at this level have to do with bullying. So what's the classroom and school climate with respect to bullying and physical and emotional safety that's supported at the school level? The social and emotional outcomes and the academic climate issues are especially important because we do know that they feed into the academic outcomes. And so even though we talk about SEL, positive teacher-student relationships, and the social and emotional outcomes, it's really important to understand that these are mediators and do predict positive learning outcomes as well. I also wanted to talk just briefly about the benefits of these relationships for teachers. We usually don't think about what's in it for teachers, and we don't have a lot of research that tells us about this, but we've done some interview studies, and teachers have told us that just as these relationships benefit teachers, students, they feel that they benefit themselves as well. And I've just put a list here of the kinds of things that teachers have mentioned when they're talking about the benefits. They feel more autonomous and self-determining in their practice when they enjoy positive relationships with students. They see changes in the climate of their classroom. There's more safety. They can make more instructional choices. They have more freedoms because of the positive interactions they have with students. And I guess the bottom line here is that we need to understand that when teachers have positive social and emotional health, so do their teachers. And we do have research that's coming out that supports that notion. Their relationships with other teachers, with administrators, and even with policy makes a big difference in terms of the stressors that teachers experience and the relationships that they then can form with their students. I often teach in our off-campus programs, and it's always interesting to me when we talk about bullying. Teachers want to talk about teachers bullying each other, which I think says a lot. And so it's not just a matter of helping students interact positively with each other, but we also need to help teachers interact positively with each other to create these positive social climates in the classroom. So one of the sort of enduring questions in the work on teacher-student relationships is, what are they and how are they defined? So we talk about them at a general level, but I wanted to share some of the work that we've done, more qualitative work, where we've actually asked adolescent students what it means to have a teacher who cares and what it means to have a teacher who doesn't care. And that's usually what they talk about when they talk about a teacher-student relationship. It's teachers who care. I've listed here just sort of general summaries, of the categories that adolescents talk about. I always talk too fast. What we thought was most impressive is that most of the comments that students made had to do with teachers helping them learn. So they saw teachers as having a role to help. It was their job to help them learn, and so teachers who care were very efficient and proficient in those roles. So they put effort into their teaching. They engaged in positive communications. They showed respect to students. They communicated expectations that were realistic and based on what students could do. And they provided nurturance and help. So there was a lot of interpersonal involvement reactions that students had. On the other hand, they talked about teachers who don't care. So teachers who don't care, and these are the things that we often think about and hear about, they're off task and they're boring. So they don't care about their jobs. They ignore you, they scream and they yell at you. They don't know who I am or what I can do, so there's no personal involvement. And they don't provide help or correct my work, okay? So these adolescents, these were ninth graders, were able to articulate very clearly, they had thought about this, you know, what it is about their relationships with their teachers that are positive and negative. And so in my own work, I've sort of summarized these things into these four categories. Teachers who care and have positive relationships with students provide a secure base and a sense of trust. So if you're familiar with the attachment literature, I think this is very much the case in terms of these relationships. They provide assistance and information, help and resources in getting things done. We also did a transition study, and Emily talked about ninth grade again as being important. And what we found is that we asked kids what they were most concerned about when they made the transition from middle school into high school. And the one thing that they talked about that was consistent throughout all of high school is that they wanted to feel competent. They wanted to be able to do things, to learn things, and to do things well. And so the importance of teachers providing assistance, good instruction, and help was really, really important to these kids, and they saw that as an indicator of helping. Emotional supports, so they did want to have some kind of interpersonal connection with their teachers. And I also wanted to mention this notion of conflict. There's a conflict in every relationship. So if you think about your own relationships with a spouse or friends or your own kids, it's going to be there, but how we handle it, I think, is the most important thing. And so they talked about resolving conflict in positive ways, teachers having positive conflict resolution skills and effective problem-solving strategies, as opposed to sort of autocratic, authoritarian strategies for problem solving. And so we need to recognize that conflict is a part of relationships, and it can produce positive things as well as negative things. We'll just click on that. Okay. So I also wanted to highlight some individual differences in what a positive teacher-student relationship means. And they have to do with age, gender, ethnicity, with student backgrounds, and student ability. In terms of age, gender, and ethnicity, we know that younger kids tend to report better relationships than older kids. Girls report better relationships than do boys, and Caucasian students report better relationships than do ethnic minority students. With respect to that last one, however, most of these studies are done in schools with Caucasian teachers. And so we need to know more about how a match between student and teacher ethnicity can facilitate these relationships, or what exactly is it that is creating that mismatch. We also know that there are a variety of background characteristics that kids bring with them from school and from their previous classrooms that also help them or hinder them from defining good teacher-student relationships. And just in the limited time, maybe we can talk about these later, but we need to understand that students bring all kinds of stuff with them into the classroom that's going to provide them with a lens, both positive and negative, in terms of developing relationships. And then finally, we know that students at different ability levels have different definitions of a positive teacher-student relationship. With high ability students talking mostly about teaching, teachers provide them with challenge, allow them to participate. They have similar educational goals. But if you talk to low ability students, they talk more about the interpersonal aspects of relationships. They want teachers to be kind and fair, to maintain control, to provide them with a safe classroom. And then some folks have also done work on academically successful inner city ethnic minority students, and there they find sort of an integration of both instructional and personal characteristics that define positive teacher-student relationships. So one size does not fit all, and I think that's another thing that you all probably know, but that we need to keep in mind when we are planning interventions and things for teachers to work on. So why do these relationships have an influence? We've talked to a lot of teachers, and we did a grounded theory qualitative study about teacher-student trust. Because when we talked to teachers about their relationships, they thought that establishing trust is really the centerpiece of a positive relationship for them. So we just asked them, how do you establish trust in your classroom? So again, this is just a list of the kinds of things that teachers talked about. And I think at this point, one of the things that I'll say that, again, impressed us was that many of them had reflected on their practice to the point where they understood how their instruction facilitated the development of trust. So they didn't necessarily tease these things apart. They understood that as a teacher, you don't have a lot of time to spend on non-instructional issues when you're in the classroom. And so they saw a lot of the things that they employed in their day-to-day practice as ways that they could facilitate the development of positive relationships and trust. And these basically, again, fell into these categories. They saw themselves providing direct support through their instruction, emotional support, expectations, again, help and resources, and safety. They also talked about extrinsic pressures that they imposed and how to do that in a good way. So teachers do provide rewards. They give grades, they give feedback, and they understood that there are certain ways to give feedback that are positive and will build trust, and there are ways to not do that. And then also, you want to provide, especially adolescents, some sense of enjoyment and fun. And so what do they do to make learning and instruction more enjoyable? And a lot of them talked about engaging the peer groups in positive ways to do this. So teachers understood the very positive and powerful role of peers in developing their relationships. So we can move on to David. I just wanted to close by saying that this really is a cyclical process. And I wanted to highlight, and we've talked about this already, that establishing positive student outcomes is going to feed back into the teacher and the climate that the teacher establishes, and to them improving their processes. And so this happens at the dyadic level, it happens at the classroom level, and it can also happen at the school level. And so once you start this cycle, hopefully it can build. But of course, the challenge is to start it and find intervention points where this can happen most successfully. I've also left you with a bibliography if you want to read academic papers. Lots out there, but a lot of these are some good reviews, I think, of the work that's been done. So thank you, and I'll be happy to answer questions later. Okay, David, it's all yours.
Thank you.
David, you're going to go,
Okay.
I promise. But Dr. Wentzel, if there are any sort of just immediate, any clarifying questions based on what she covered? I have one. One of your early slides used the term communities of care at the school climate level. Could you just say a little more what that term means?
Well, it's sort of used broadly in the literature, but basically what people refer to are communities, sort of like the ones that Emily was talking about, where teachers come together to focus on the needs of students in a positive way, and they promote a sense of caring as opposed to and facilitating growth rather than getting rid of negative outcomes. We talk a lot about deficit approaches and how we want to discourage them in terms of working with kids and developing positive relationships. And so the phrase communities of care is sort of broadly defined, I think, focus on that notion that we need to build on and support the positive things that kids can do. And people coming together as a community to do that. You know, we can't just depend on one person, one teacher to accomplish all of this. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question. Just in terms of the relationship aspect, is it like a one-to-one relationship where a student will be good if that teacher is good to them, or is there like a buffer where if the student likes the principal, then the student can engage in class even with the teacher that they feel a disconnect from?
It's a good question. Most of the research is on the individual teacher-student relationship. So we tend to ask kids questions about their teachers less often, but we do ask teachers questions about individual students, you know, and how they mesh. The degree to which a good relationship with someone outside the classroom is going to facilitate a positive relationship inside the classroom, I think, is an interesting question we really don't know a whole lot about. My sense is, and maybe this is just my own personal experience decades ago as a high school student, but I think sometimes having positive relationships outside the classroom when you don't necessarily have a good one with an individual teacher does help buffer. And you can sort of ignore the negative and look forward beyond that class to other things that are in high school. And that goes to the notion of community as well. So, you know, if for whatever reason you aren't developing a positive relationship with this teacher, it's not going to kill your academic trajectory as long as you have other relationships, other people who are looking out for you. Yeah.
All right. Sorry. Sorry, not to totally cut off, but we're going to hear from David, and then we'll have a brief panel discussion, then there will be time for discussion. So please write it down so you don't lose it. Your question.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning. I wanted to start because I told Dr. Wentzel this in the back, but when I was in college, I read one of her papers with regards to the prediction of academic outcomes in high school from kindergarten social skills. And I was so engrossed by this. I was like, this was a reason, one of the reasons why I've dedicated kind of the time I have to social emotional development, because it's people like you who help me to understand that there's more to learning than what we get out of textbooks. So I just want to give a shout out to Dr. Wentzel because her research is impactful, right? And it's impacted me. So I hope we can. I hope it shows in this this report. So first thing I want to do is start out with where we're at in terms of social emotional learning in 2019. So we have Aspen Commission, spent 2.5 years bringing together some people talking about a nation at hope, right? Rephrasing this idea of a nation at risk to think about how social, emotional, and academic development can help us get to the next space in terms of educational outcomes. So you have your research brief, you got the practice brief, you got your policy brief. Over on the bottom, on the Castle has partnered with Civic talking about Ready to Lead, right? And they did this review of all these school leaders, and all these school leaders like, absolutely, social emotional learning sounds like a good idea, we can do it. So we're in a place right now where this term, this concept is not unfamiliar to people. It's not unfamiliar to school leaders, but there's a disconnect, right, between what we say and what we do. The research says, research like Dr. Wentzel, research like Dr. Elias, Dr. Brackett says it improves academics, it reduces risky behaviors, and improves prosocial behaviors and attitudes, reduces the need for punitive disciplinary and research, and improves mental health. Most people say that's important, right? But going back to that Ready to Lead, 98% of principals said that students should be taught social emotional skills. Only 35% of schools and school leaders had a plan to do so. And I want to take a second to think about that, because without a plan, we're talking about time and space. The hardest thing to do in schools is to create time and space for an outcome, right? With no plan, we're never going to get to outcomes for our students. So people say they want to do this, but there are no systems in schools to facilitate movement from intent to impact. 25% of people who were actually doing social and emotional learning were doing it with high quality as according to the CASEL standards, right? So now, out of the people who said they had a plan, the 25% are actually doing it, or excuse me, only 25% of them were actually doing it with a way that would impact students. Now think about that. So now we're dedicating time and space, right? But not doing it well enough to actually impact students. So kind of like, what's the point, right? And then the support for school-wide social emotional learning in high school drops down to 25%. So thinking about college and career readiness, thinking about the translation between academic preparedness in 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th, 12th grade, and what it takes to be persistent in college, what employers are looking for in terms of post-secondary outcomes. And then we're looking at this for 25% of high school leaders who say, yes, this is a school-wide priority for me. So what are we going to do to address these differences? Here at the UA, we've thought about 3 kind of main approaches. First is to scan, understand what's already happening, then it's a plan. Bridge the gap between intent and implementation, and then we act. What do we mean by scan? All right, what is already happening that teaches or reinforces social and emotional competencies? What is already happening in your school? So one of the things I think that is really frustrating to school leaders is the fact that people do not respect what they're already doing. Some cool researcher comes out with some great idea, right? They get into the head of the CEO or superintendent and is like, this is the thing, all right? And then, bang, it comes down to the schools, we're gonna do this thing. Principal's got like 30,000 other things to do, too bad, you're gonna do this first. So one of the things that we've tried to understand, right, is that all schools are doing things that impact social and emotional self. Let's honor that. Now, they may not be doing it well, but that's a conversation we have about moving into intent to impact. So what is already happening that either teaches directly, develops social emotional skills, or reinforces, provides the conditions for social emotional skills to develop? What is happening in instructional practices? Just a quick example, turn and talks, quality discussion, Danielson framework, right? We're all focused on the quality discussion in classrooms. How do we shift that from just content to social emotional learning? We do it by debriefs, we do it by direct instruction. Extracurricular activities. How do we create a link between what's happening in our schools and what's happening in our after-school activities? What language do we use to bridge that gap? The Aspen Commission worked really hard to create a common language, right, so that we can at least come together and instead of fighting about non-cognitive versus social and emotional, come to a peace and say we're all kind of thinking about the types of skills that allow our students to be successful. By bridging that language gap, we can increase the intensity of supports for our kids. Behavioral supports, right? One of the things that we ask our schools to think about in the schools that we support is how do these behavioral supports, how do detentions, how do suspensions, how do kid talk help develop the skills that our students need to be successful? Dr. Wentzel said this really well, and actually I wrote it down. We need to talk about facilitating growth versus getting rid of bad things, right? We need to facilitate the outcomes of our students, and one of the things that we talk about is how we teach teachers to shift their attitudes around the way that our students need to learn. And then lastly, social and emotional supports. So how are our social and emotional supports moving from what I call palliative, right, like holding kids, feeling good about them, to skill development? in our counseling outcomes, right? In our extracurricular things like mentoring. It's not just about being there. It's about being there and delivering the skills so that our students can transfer those things effectively. Now, being there is the first part, but as you're there, you need to transfer those skills. Then we talk about planning. What do we need in order to increase the quality of SEL programming in your school? We need to directly instruct these skills, we need to integrate, and then we need to assess. A lot of the work we do here is focusing on how to schools create the time and space for social and emotional learning in their school, right? And one of the things that we've learned over the years of doing this is we used to say, we're going to teach you how to do social emotional learning. And now we say, we're going to work with you to organize your school around social emotional development. I'm just going to say that again. We used to say, we're going to teach you how to do social emotional learning. And now we say, we're going to organize your school around social emotional development, right? Which means, what are the inputs that your school is using to support social emotional development for teachers and for students? How are you integrating? How are you assessing? And how are you making sure that our students are making impact? And then lastly, we're going to ask, explicitly teach social emotional skills to staff and students, maximize integration, and assess learning. If the hardest thing to do in schools is to create time and space, then if we maximize integration from a base of direct instruction, right, then we can mitigate that challenge by having students have consistent feedback through consistent language over CBOs, extracurricular activities, instructional practices, and social emotional supports. All right. So we're going to go one by one through this, and then we're going to talk about some of the impact that we've had in our schools. SCAN. So the quote that I try and get is, we're already doing most of this. If I'm sitting here in a group of educators or principals or district people, and they say, I think we're already doing this, David, I say, I have done my job, right? It's like, yes, that's the point. We're already doing this. Are we doing it in a way that students can transfer these skills and impact their academic and their social emotional lives? So it's not about starting SEL, it's about enhancing the work you're already doing around social emotional development. All right, Dr. Wentzel talked about it. Every interaction that a student has with another student or another teacher, right, is an opportunity for social emotional development. They're either learning skills or learning from models in terms of positive ways, or they're learning things around how to cope and how to solve problems in ways that are less effective in terms of their coping. Every opportunity that we have in terms of interactions, which is most of the school day, is an opportunity to develop these skills. The quality of language is related to the quality of concepts. When we teach kids language that allow them to understand that active listening is an actual thing that impacts relationship skills, then they'll see those opportunities for active listening across their school day and in their home and in their communities and with their teachers. So the first thing we do is scan. What are you already doing? Let's honor the work schools are doing. Let's recognize the fact that we have a teacher shortage, that teaching is not the most attractive profession today, right? And adding pressure to teachers by not honoring what they're already doing is not going to get us to where we need to be in terms of social emotional development. Planning, all right? So we use a framework from Carl Rogers, who was a researcher from like 1970s, and he was focused on how ideas move through social systems. All right, he was focused on agriculture and identified 5 attributes of innovation. Talked about relative advantage. How much better does this do something as opposed to what other people did? So, for example, Netflix has relative advantage over Blockbuster because you don't have to go out to get it. There are no late fees. You can do it from your home. Is relative advantage. And when we look at, I think, some of the concepts, I think we assume that just because something is better, just because it reduces suspension, it increases academics, means that people are going to do it. And I think when you actually think about the rest of these pieces, what we've seen is that relative advantage is like the fourth most important thing when moving or having people adopt new ideas. So the second thing he looks at is observability. How observable are the outcomes of these concepts? All right? How observable are the outcomes of these concepts? For social emotional learning, we focus a lot on trying to make this work observable. All right? We interview kids, we interview teachers. When students solve a problem, we stop and we say, hey, what problem have you solved? And we feedback back to teachers. We make sure that teachers can see the outcomes of the work because social emotional learning is sometimes difficult to have observability. Compatibility. So if you're going to ask me, what is the most important aspect of moving ideas through social systems, specifically social emotional learning, I would answer to you compatibility. How compatible is this idea with pre-existing values and systems that exist in school or the district? All right. It's compatibility that I think is the most important thing in terms of driving sustainability. I can't go into a school and change their culture, right? School people have to change their culture. They have to see the meaning of this work. So we spend a lot of time trying to think about, what's your school vision and mission? What do you talk about? How do you talk about your students? What is the portrait of a graduate? And how does that relate to social emotional skills, attitudes, and mindsets that will allow them to be successful? Complexity, how hard is it to do? Triability, can we try it before we do it? When we think about planning, we think about all these things in terms of how we organize schools and districts around social emotional development. The big question that we are pushing our schools to answer is, can students currently transfer the skills being developed, why or why not? If the point of learning is transfer skills from a place of where it was learned to a novel situation where they didn't have experience before, the question that we need to really focus on is moving the unit from schools, is my school climate good? Do I feel good about behavior? To students. Can students learn skills, attitudes, and mindsets that they can actually transfer to solve real problems in the real world in novel situations, all right? If we can move our teachers from thinking about social emotional development as a school-based thing, is this making my school better? To a student-based thing, is this helping my students become more effective? Then we're doing our good job at in terms of planning. And then lastly, ACT. We need to maximize space for SEL programming, time and space, right? People think that schools are about ideas. Schools are about time and space. If we can solve time and space issues, we can get things done. So the work that we do in terms of acting is we put the onus on principals. Look, this is what we're trying to do. Find me the time and space, whether it's in science class, literature class, advisory. If you find me the time and space, your students will improve in the types of things that are going to help them be successful. So moving from big picture to really nuts and bolts. It's on the school, time and space, that's what's going to get us going. So what do we know from this approach that we've done in our schools in UA? So we partner with Fordham University School of Social Service, and they've helped evaluate some of our work around social emotional learning. Our work is based on 3 principles: direct instruction, assessment, and integration, with a big emphasis on quality of implementation and sustainability. So what we've seen is that students with IEPs make the most growth. We're talking about equity, right? And that's really important because we're talking about a universal intervention here, right, that makes a high amount of impact on students with the highest amount of need. I think the concept is that we need more counselors, we need more individualized supports. But if we do a good job at creating the conditions at the universal level, our students with the highest needs show the most amount of growth on social emotional assessment. Number 2, we found that social emotional learning predicts about 22% of the variance in attendance, right? So about 23% of the differences in attendance, even when looking at, we're gonna cut it off at 80%. So any student below 80%, we're not gonna include in that. So just cutting it off at 80%, about 23% of students' attendance is related to their social emotional competence, as measured through the Devereux Student Strength Assessment. 43% of high school GPA related to social emotional competence. Social emotional implementation quality predicts social emotional growth. It seems really obvious, right? But the quality of implementation, which is how we organize our schools around social emotional learning, is a predictor of whether or not students actually grow in their social emotional skills. And then lastly, implementation scores that predict about 30% of the school's impact on students' achievement outcomes. So looking at how schools have organized themselves on an implementation rubric predicts about 30% of how well that school impacts student achievement overall, all right? The point of this is that ways that schools are organized are the ways that schools are organized. And the way that they organize around social emotional learning tends to be the way they organize around a lot of things. So if we can help them organize effectively around social emotional development, it turns out a lot of what other systems within the schools that they need to do in terms of academics are also related to how well they organize around social and emotional learning. Nope. All right. So we're talking about social emotional development. We're thinking about what are relationships between learning and social emotional outcomes. We identified foundations for quality implementation. We know implementation drives outcomes. And we talked about 3 things. We talked about scanning. Let's honor what's already happening in school. Go in where they need it. Understand what they're already doing in the 4 areas of school life: instructional practices, extracurricular activities, behavioral supports, and social emotional supports. Then we talked about planning, time and space. Then we talked about acting. Make sure that we're teaching directly so students understand the skills and that the language becomes the foundation for the concepts so they can generalize these skills into novel situations. Thank you.
schools and just, if there are any quick clarifying questions based on these slides, and then we'll go into the panel.
Just one quick one, just for context. I'm not familiar. Could you share a little bit about what the Urban Assembly is and how you work with schools?
Yes. So the Urban Assembly is a nonprofit that works predominantly in New York City. And essentially, we have been granted a kind of like an innovation zone waiver within New York City to work with 22 schools. And so we work with those schools and on behalf of the Department of Education in order to produce innovations that scale to the larger system. We're also doing work specifically around SEL in different other places, Los Angeles, Syracuse, and Houston. But the Urban Assembly itself is an institution that's designed to produce innovations on behalf of the Department of Education.
Thank you.
Cheers.
David, when you say the word direct instruction,
yeah,
can you say what you mean by that?
Yeah, so we need to be able to have students and teachers, right, understand the concepts that drive meaning. So just for an example, right, there's an activity, there's a concept, and there's a skill. Concept of self-management is that the way I feel does not have to be the way that I behave, right? That's a concept. Like when you teach kids that concept, they start to say, oh, well, that's a thing because I do what I feel. And you're like, oh, wow, you don't have to, right? So that's the thing, right? Like, and you have to teach them that for them to be able to transfer that. So once you teach them this concept, then you start to think about, all right, what are some skills? What are some actual things that I can do to separate how I feel and how I behave? And then we think about what are the activities that teach those skills, right? So what are the actual things? So I think some of the argument now has been, you know, if we embed social emotional development in everything that we do, our students will understand these things and transfer them. I think if we don't give them the concept, then they have difficulty recognizing the situations that they would use those skills and then transfer them to novel situations in which they haven't been developed under. So
yeah, that's super helpful.
Okay.
Super helpful.
I know a lot of words I was trying to leave it.
Melissa, do you want to join? So we're going to shift to a brief panel discussion with all of our speakers today, who I want to say thank you again to and ask them to join. This would be Emily, David, and Kathryn, if you want to join up here. Melissa's got some questions and spend a few minutes all together. I think, and our goal right now is really to actually start to intersect some of these concepts. So we've heard a storytelling perspective, the research perspective, and practice perspective. So I'm going to hand it over to Melissa to kind of draw out the intersections.
So I want to start by asking you all to reflect on the term of social, emotional, and academic development. We heard about the role of relationships in learning. We know that learning is multidimensional and involves social, emotional, and cognitive components. So if you were to define or describe what social, emotional, and academic development is, how would you do that? And I know you could write a whole brief on this, and whole frameworks have been developed on this, but if you were to summarize it in thinking about like Urban Assembly's work in 1 to 2 sentences, how would you describe it, just to ground our conversation?
So I could take a shot. I think so we talk about the process by which students and adults develop the skills, attitudes, and mindsets that allow them to relate to themselves, relate to others, solve problems, and make effective decisions. So I think the 4 things we think about: how do you relate to yourself? How do you relate to others? How does that help you solve problems and how does it help you make good decisions in the context of skills, attitudes, and mindsets?
Emily and Kathryn, do you have any reaction to that? Would you add anything if you were thinking about your own definition?
I think, well, the problem with the academic literature is that everyone makes their own definition. And so if you wade into that literature, it becomes really messy very quickly. But I think what people are talking about most these days are executive functioning. Okay, so emotion regulation skills and the kinds of brain level functioning and self-regulatory functions that kids learn how to do that then helps them regulate their behavior and their learning outcomes. in my own work, I just think of it holistically as all of those social and emotional things that contribute to learning. And I think you gave a great definition, David. I think that's pretty, yeah, good. I think that pretty much says it all.
So one thing that we really wanted to tackle here is bridging between the research and the practice, whether that's in schools and classrooms or in community settings with young people. So if you think about the research behind how learning happens or the role of relationships in learning, what do you feel is the number one implication for the art and science of teaching or for working with young people? I'll start with you. Yeah, I'll start with you.
Well, I know you were interested in the brain. I can tell what I'm about to say is about the extent to which I know about brain development, but I think it's something that we have to focus on in adolescence, especially early in young adolescents. Connections in the brain are growing, and we're making new connections. And how that translates into learning is that, well, and the other thing that's happening is puberty, right? So we've got hormones going on, and we've got brains going in all directions. And so with respect to learning, what that means for adolescents is that they become more open to exploring things in a positive way. They are better able to take another's perspective. They are better able to focus on abstract terms. And so teaching that focuses on those kinds of processes is much more successful with kids because they enjoy it, they engage in it. The downside of it is that all of this change can be very stressful. And so at the same time that teachers can benefit from allowing adolescents to explore ideas and debate and interact with each other, they also have to provide structure so that it doesn't get out of control, and that you can provide guidelines for them as they are trying to solve these problems. If you think of identity development, I think that's a good way to capture this. So we know adolescents try on all different kinds of identities, hairstyles, clothing, music, all these things that they love one day and hate the next, right? They're just trying all of these things on. So they need to be allowed to do that and to think in creative ways, but also have the structure to feel safe in doing that. As kids get older, the brain starts to, they call it pruning, these connections. And adolescents tend to become more focused on things that they identify with and really love to do. And so then teachers need to support the passions that adolescents have and help them develop in depth those intrinsic, if you will, ideas and passions that they have in the classroom.
I think I'd only add, I think when we talk about what means to be educated, we are assuming that people can identify and solve problems. And so content gives us the ability to understand the problem, right? Like if you don't know anything, it's just hard to define the problem. But problem solving is a cognitive and social and emotional function. It's everything. You know, I was teaching my son the other day to tie his shoe, and he was not getting it. He's 5, and you know he's got his fingers going on, and I'm thinking, man, this is really frustrating, right? Like, 10 times I'm doing this thing, and it wasn't the technical aspects that was the most difficult for him. It was the technical plus the frustration, right? And so that just like when we teach, we teach the thing, and then we process the feeling. And when we expect people to solve problems and we're not accounting for the feeling, you know, then we're not going to be able to solve those problems effectively.
So in your work with urban assembly teachers or in some of the work that you witnessed in Chicago schools or other schools where you've been in working on, have you seen intentional efforts to talk with teachers about the science of learning and to understand kind of developmental milestones and where their students are and all of what Kathryn was talking about in terms of like what they're grappling with and at that moment in time?
I think I've seen some of this, and sometimes when I'm watching this, I think of myself, like I'm thinking of myself as a parent also, in addition to an observer of how teachers are interacting. And along with the Freshmen on Track movement, there was a lot of intentional effort to get people to understand what was going on, that Kathryn described really well, from a biological standpoint. And I saw how that changed people's perception of the work, because it made them feel better about kids' behavior when you felt like there's a biological and like developmental component of it. And it doesn't mean they're always going to be, this is a stage, and they're behaving exactly how they should behave in this stage, and there's nothing pathological about it. And I realized, like, as a parent, sometimes I need to hear that too, because it's like, you know, my kid's lying on the floor and throwing a fit, and like, I'm the worst, and he's the worst, and like, this, you know, who knows what's going to happen to him, and then my anxiety starts like ramping up, because I'm like, we have to nip this in the bud, and what does this mean? He'll never go to college, you know. And it's, if you can have like a little bit of perspective and be like, no, it's totally developmentally normal behaving like that, and so I think it can be a relief too to like really understand.
I would add that we have an off-campus program at the university for secondary level teachers, and what we teach is adolescent development in all its forms, and this is what teachers want to know about. You know, they're pretty proficient in teaching their subject area, right? They don't necessarily want university people coming in and telling them how to teach algebra, or, you know, they've been trained in that. But learning about the neuroscience and neurodevelopment and motivation development of adolescent students, you know, the stuff that they don't know that much about, really helps them relate to their students and understand how to hone their practice, taking those things into consideration.
I think from my perspective, I love the idea of human development as a title, right? Like, I work in human development. That's important. Like, our schools, if we could work to shift the attitudes, and say that we teach kids, and say that we develop people, right? Then, like, our teachers start to say, this is worth the time and effort. You know, I wish, you know, you have like childhood development, adolescent development. It's like, we're all developing all the time. And I think what social emotional learning contributes is a language that articulates the end state. Like, it says, like, we should have a sense of personal responsibility. Now, you can apply that to taking your student, your young brother to school, which a lot of students do. Like, just to your point, when we were looking at students who are failing, a lot of our students were taking their younger kids to school. And our teachers would say, well, they're not being responsible. And they were actually like, I'm showing responsibility. I have responsibilities. I actually run most of the things in my house. So yes, I missed my homework. But actually, I do a lot of things. So I guess my only point is, I think social emotional learning gives us a language. It says that we should have the ability to maintain relationships. We should be able to make decisions and solve problems and manage our emotions. And I think that's what we talk about. It's not an end state. There's no, I have developed, right? It is a continuum that we're all working on. And once we understand what that looks like, then we're able to say to our kids, oh, we need to continue to make growth on your sense of responsibility and apply it to your schoolwork, because it's as important you do well in school as it is you.
So let's say we've achieved this mindset shift, and, you know, our practitioners, whether they're in school classrooms or in community settings, have this understanding and awareness. There's still a lot of barriers to making this happen. So what do you think are some of the biggest barriers, and what are some ways that they can start to be overcome? Like, how have urban assembly schools start to overcome them? How have Chicago schools start to overcome them? We talked about this a little bit. I know time and space came up a lot.
Just my answer.
So I think that's a huge question. I think we all can see where time and space would be a big barrier to doing this work well. So how are places, communities, schools grappling with that and solving for that?
Well, if I may, I think one of the things that you had said that was really important to me was, like, people solve their own problems in their own ways. Like, if you create a problem set and say, this is what we're trying to accomplish, it is the role of the administrator to solve that problem. Like, I can help them, you know, work it through, but I don't know your school. Like, I don't know your teachers. I don't even know Chicago, right? I can't tell you how to do that. So I think one of the things that we can do is just give people problem sets and say, like, I need you to help me figure that out. Because we've seen it in 20-minute sessions, we've seen it embedded into science, we've seen it all different ways of how this work happens. But it's our administrators who are the creative people, our teachers who can say, I got you, I'm going to give you a good kind of a college try, and we're going to come back to you with some approaches to solving that situation.
Yeah, I was so excited to see your framework. I mean, I was like writing furiously and trying to get around it and take photos. I was like, you actually articulated in two different slides. One, why I think it's spread, but also your plan, scan, act. I mean, that's basically what was happening in these freshman teams, was people were taking a look at what existed, making plans, and then trying to gauge whether they were working or not. And when you talk about the biggest challenge, for me, the biggest challenge of getting people to work on this was, first, at least in most of the schools where I was spending, with people saying, that's not my job, that's not what I do, I teach content or whatever. But when you dig a little bit deeper on that, it wasn't about, it's not my job, it's, I don't know how to do that, you know? And so it wasn't necessarily that people didn't want to be effective, but they didn't know how to do that. They hadn't had the training, they hadn't had the coaching. And so remembering that adults need that help, just like kids do, to get to the point where they know how to teach those things, and making that a part of developing educators.
Another thing that I think we've sort of forgotten about but is really important is to involve the home, involve parents, and teach parents social and emotional skills and how to model those skills to their kids. And it's a really difficult thing to do, and I certainly don't have many ideas about how to engineer those kinds of programs. But there are some districts who have been successful. Folks out in Nevada, for instance, have developed some really good home school partnerships where they call them parent universities. And parents, I mean, it's after school, but parents learn these skills and come to value the importance of them, and then learn how to model them for their kids. So not only are children getting these experiences at school, but they're also being reinforced at the home. And it also helps build that bridge between the home and school, to help define what these things mean in that community, and how they can be worn out in various activities within that community. I think that's sort of a next new direction.
So that kind of makes me think about a topic that came up a lot at the Educator Writers Association conference, which happened recently. They did a deep dive on the whole student. And a big topic of conversation in that was there was a principal of a school here in Washington, D.C. that's really known for doing this work. And she made the point that if we go into this work with the lens of trying to fix students, and particularly students of color, that's completely wrong, the wrong way to go about it. And so I'm wondering, based on your practical experience, well, first of all, do you agree with these concerns? I mean, other concerns that have been brought up that are kind of similar to this is like the idea of grit and the fact that, okay, we just need to instill grit in students and then they'll be able to overcome all these horrible barriers in their lives. Or this idea that different cultures kind of value different things, and our culture puts a value on kind of personal excellence, but other cultures might put more of a value on the collective. And so when we're talking about developing the whole student and these skills in our students, how do we do that in ways that are culturally responsive, that really work for the diversity of learners in our classroom and their families? And so I'm just curious, what do you think about these concerns, and how can schools and community settings kind of navigate that?
So I have one of my favorite quotes that one of the researchers who, she's like a quote machine. There was a couple, I was at the WA symposium, and a couple of people came up to me and I was like, oh my gosh, I always call Melissa Rodriguez and I just want like one awesome quote because she'll just give it to you. But she was, one of her favorite quotes was like, no kid have to be gritty enough to like survive in this crappy environment in this high school. And for a long time in Chicago, that was absolutely true. Nobody should have had to be gritty enough to survive in that environment. So certainly a lot of it is about the context that you're in versus some intrinsic value, you know, and you see that all the time where when people start talking about kids and they've seen them in different contexts, how different kids look, you know, and you'll be like, basketball coach will be like, that's, you know, my toughest kid or whatever, or the art teacher who will say, like, this kid is amazingly creative and brilliant, and then, like, the social studies teacher is like, I can't get them to engage in anything, and so that's about context. That's not just about the kid, you know, and so I think there's this push-pull between what's the context, and are you creating context in your school and in your classrooms that bring out these qualities of students, or are you just instilling things in them? Because there's a tension between that. The one other thing I would say about that is, you know, it's a challenge, and it's true for researchers too. Like at my job at Spencer, we struggle with this a lot. Like researchers often start with like a problem or a conundrum, you know, and what is the danger of starting with a problem versus thinking about it some other way. And I think one of the things that was talked about at Spencer, and also I think this is really relevant for schools, is like talking to kids about what they want and like their goals and their dreams versus like the challenges. And so, you know, thinking about it in terms of opportunities, and one of the teachers that I interviewed talked about freshmen on track as a talent loss strategy, or like as a talent strategy, because there's all this talent and it needs to get out there. So talent retainment, not talent loss, but talent retainment. Like what? So if you're, you know, when I think about, again, back to my kids, when I think about my kids, I'm thinking about what are the skills they need to get the like happy future that I envision for them. You know, and thinking about it that way.
Yeah, I agree. I think Dr. Wentzel talked about the idea of promotion. That was a really big shift to me. I used to talk about prevention, and then I met with a person who said, no, we're promoting healthy development. You know, I think the analogy that I use is we don't have kids engage in physical activity like gym class because we're preventing obesity, right? We are promoting healthy living and healthy engagement. And so our young people can learn this in two ways. I imagine, you know, putting a young person in front of a basketball game, right, and say, hey, just watch this, all right, and you tell me what the rules are after watching it for 30 minutes, right? And so, you know, maybe they figure it out and maybe they don't, you know, and you put them in the game and they start getting fouls and you start yelling at them, you fouled out, you know. Or we could have them watch a game and I can coach them and I can say, you know, watch the way that they're doing this. Like, that's the rule there, right? Actually pay attention to the way that, you know, how many steps that he can take. Of course, if you're James Harden, it's a different story, right? But, like, there are two approaches. The first approach is we just let people live life, right? And we just have them walk around and be like, I've got this, I'm really good, and either live it or struggle. And the other approach is to say, like, here are some things that through, like, the evolution of human history that are as important. Like, we have always said positive relationships are important. Integration into society is important. The quality of relationships, regardless of it's individual or community-based, the quality of relationships that we have are an important aspect of human development. And so I think when we get to that universal level, we're seeing similar things. There is no society that has ever existed that said the quality of decision-making of our society has no meaning to us. We should not invest in that. Just good luck, you know? So when we get wider, I think we get to a place where this is about young people developing. It's about what kind of society that we're looking to have our people live in. And when we come to an agreement that these are types of things and mindsets that are useful, and I think that we're going to come to a place where we're going to invest in that every day in education and after school.
think I would only add that in the academic community and the policy community as well, there's a real tension as to how we're going to document, right, social and emotional development, how our schools and programs are going to be held accountable. And I think it's a very dangerous notion, because once we assign a score to a student, it becomes the student's problem. And so I think it does us, it would serve us well to think about these more global outcomes and indicators in a context. Right? What are the outcomes that we want to see in our schools, in our society, and in our kids, but at a group level, so that we don't go down the path of this kid needs help because they don't know how to do this. Yeah, we can give them the skills, but we don't want to create, again, this deficit approach by assigning scores. You know, there's, you know, you have a social emotional score of 0 or 10, right, on this range, and that's where we run into problems in terms of accountability. But we love scores. We love tests. That's what our society is all about. So I think we need to think about that very carefully, how we're going to rectify that and move the field forward without setting these standards that schools and individuals have to meet.
Thank you. So I know we're running short on time. I'd like you all to join me in thanking the panel. And do we have time for audience questions? Okay. Well, let's thank you all. Any questions?
Yeah, I was just for Dr. Wentzel, like how you defined high ability and low ability. Like I was just curious what you used for definition.
That actually wasn't my research, but what people usually do is take the top and bottom ends of a academic continuum. Okay. You know, so you're taking the really high achieving students and the really low achieving students, separate them out as groups, and then focus on how they're simply different. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
I had a question, just from a policy standpoint, since the passage of like the ESSA Act and everything, there's been a lot of focus on kind of the needs assessment process. At least I've been focusing on it as schools getting together and making decisions about kind of the long-term outcomes that they want to see for their students, and that as an opportunity to look more at the whole student or whole child. And just in any of your work, have any of you been part of a process like that? Or is there a way to think about using that process as a means to get the parents and the students who should be there at the table to talk more holistically about the outcomes that they want for students' long-term success?
So, yeah, I mean, the ESSA reauthorization is interesting because I think many schools and districts have been looking at school climate as the optional, like non-academic measure. The social emotional learning was offered. I think Dr. Wentzel alluded to some of the challenges in terms of using SEL as an accountability measure. So to my knowledge, no districts used SEL as their option, but many are using school culture and climate. Or absenteeism, yes, thank you. So yeah, I don't know what the connection between parents are, but I can say from my perspective, just I think with Dr. Wenzel's point, if we can articulate the outcomes, other people can articulate the process. So like if we say, you know, we're working with our students to make sure that they leave our schools with the ability to communicate effectively, what can we do to work with you at home on that? I think our parents are into that. If you say you have to talk to your kid in this way, that way, then you create these barriers. So I guess the only thing I would say is if we do a better job at talking to people about what we're trying to accomplish, like people they'll do that work. But I think if we tell them how to do it, it gets a little bit of backlash.
So one thing I would add to that is that in Illinois, one of the climate measures that they've adopted is and it's on your sheet where it says there's a little block in the dark blue and the light blue or whatever. Don't even get me started on blues, but it's based on research that came out of, again, the consortium that measured, it's based on student and teacher survey data. And I remember when I first came to the consortium and people were talking about trust, and I was like, well, that's like just this very squishy concept. And then I learned that, oh, you could actually measure it in like really robust ways. So anyway, I think survey data from teachers and students and parents is really another interesting way to get at what's happening climate at the school.
How do you use that survey data in a way that people don't see as punitive? I was talking to the DC task force, and they were thinking of adopting some survey measures into their accountability system. Everyone that came up, the parents and the students were having feedback of, well, people are going to be categorized, in one way or another. And so that, I think this goes to your communication piece. How do you communicate that these things are important, but how do you do it in a way that says, we have this data, we're trying to make gains on it,
right,
but we're not using it to say, you're not doing well or punish you, because that's sort of the normal way that people are experiencing data.
Yeah. Now that I'm not the communications director of the consortium, I can just say this. Like, I wish that it had never been on the accountability framework. I think that's just silly, to be honest, the way that they did it in the state. And I think it was a lot more powerful. It used to be actually schools would get the information, and it was just private, and it was based on their teachers and their kids. It made it a lot easier to work on, and people were less defensive about it because it just felt like a tool. And they were able to discuss with other schools, like, this is what's going on, and this is what I'm hearing, and people were spending more time actually looking at it rather than like having a visceral negative reaction to it.
Yeah, I think it's really important. So if you've collected the data and you have all these data points that supposedly reflect human processes, it's really important to get the constituents, the teachers, the parents, and even the students to reflect on what the data mean for them. So if you're not going to be able to collect qualitative data along with the survey data, so that can inform in a richer way the kinds of things that you're looking for, to have those discussions. So, our school is at this level according to these items. Does that make sense for you? What does it mean, and how can we work with that information to improve what we're doing? So somehow you have to find a way to contextualize it. And if you don't, it becomes meaningless for a lot of people, and they're just not going to pay attention to it.
I think Emily had talked earlier about facilitation. I think there is just we can do better with regards to our sophistication around data. I think districts have mentalities and hierarchies, and are not as sophisticated as we could be in terms of doing the types of things like problem solving, identifying trends, where are the bright spots, what are the implications of this, how does this data relate to your experience. I do believe without the data being out there, movement doesn't happen. I think when you're looking at the shift from Common Core, for example, people have lowered their standards, and our students are not progressing in the same way. So I think there are ideas out there that are helpful. Social, emotional learning, school climate is an important piece. People started caring about school climate in New York City when they started publishing school climate data in their accountability. That's just how it was. It used to be private, and people didn't care. And now it's public. People are like, hey, Dave, can you come talk to me at my school climate? So we just, I think, got to do better at problem solving rather than hitting people over the head, because it is this kind of data that I think helps our schools move forward.
That's a better answer. I agree with that.
I want to check in on the phone if there's anyone with a question. I know it's hard to break in. All right, make a sound if you have a question. Heidi has a question, and then those of us in the room can continue.
The last conversation about data as a concrete example of like a theory versus practice translation of like all the positive ways it could be used and all of how complex it is to actually use it the right way. I'm just curious to hear what the panel of experts think about the current balance of problem solvers and thought leaders and experts working on policy and ideas versus partnering side by side with schools inside the schools every day to making those I'm just curious about what your experience has been as, like, David, your slide about like the fire that's been lit around SEL of like, oh, this is language now, social emotional academic development is something you're hearing, whole child development, however you call it, is, you know, like on the verge of becoming one of those categorical buzzwords or whatever. But what would you say about that balance in the field that you noticed, and the impact it might be having on, like, is there too much policy and research all on the same thing and not enough people really translating it on the ground? And is that, how do we work on that problem across sectors?
Well, I mean, the consortium is a really great example. I think the best work I tend to see in school and educational reforms tends to be when universities are plugged into actual real-life teachers and administrators, and not, you know, worried about, am I getting tenure because this is important, but like, are people seeing the work that I'm doing live throughout student outcomes? So, you know, the Research Alliance in New York City has looked to replicate the system out in Chicago. To the extent that people like Aspen and America's Promise are getting into schools and seeing, does this work, does this make sense, I think it's the extent to which this work is going to make an impact. So I would only say that policy folks talk to other policy folks. They listen, we all nod, and we're like, good job, go home. We write white papers that other policy folks read, but still translate to educators. Educators are so happy to get out of their school, just for one day, just for a break, right? Like, hey, let's go, you know, down the street to another school. That's a big deal. We're not talking to the people who do the work, and we have to. I don't know. It's a frustrating thing for me. Our teachers care. They want to know how to get better. Our principals care. They want to know how to get better, but they need to have access to these pieces. And organizations like the consortium are examples of people who care enough. University of Washington, Tacoma, in their whole child initiative, like, they got into the schools. They were partners, right? If their schools failed, we failed. They put their teachers and their university out in the schools. So I just think that's the kind of thing that needs to happen if policymakers and researchers want to make their mark on the education system.
Another way to think of this is the whole conversation around what is evidence, right? And so for a long time now, it's been very top-down. We need to conduct these randomized controlled trials, and that's the gold standard. And, you know, if we find significant results, it's going to generalize to everybody, and that's all we need to know. And then you describe these studies to classroom teachers, and they're like, well, that's not us. That's not us. That's not our school. This means, you know, what can we do with this? And so there has to be a melding of the minds, merging of the minds. So how can we translate what we found, you know, in these highly controlled studies to what's going on in this school, in this context, and really focus on professional development as a partnership with schools rather than, well, this is what we found, so this is what you have to do. Because most of the time, replication doesn't work, just because there is no, that conversation doesn't there.
And I think there's a role for intermediary organizations too. I mean, I think the consortium is awesome, but they're still researchers, you know, and so I think there was a really important role for, again, like the Network for College Success, which sort of played this intermediary role in bridging. I hate the word translator because they used to translate research, it's just ridiculous. But like, you know, playing this role between, they were practitioners who also spoke the language of research, and they were able to sort of take that, but then build on it. And they had, again, the time and space. Like, classroom teachers don't have the time and space to do a scan of all the research out there, all of the, you know, like, no, you've got your lesson plan for tomorrow. So to have this sort of go-between, you could say, like, I've read 30 good studies on this, and I can sort of boil it down and then help you put it into practice. That's so important, and there should be more of those intermediary organizations.
If I can just catch one more thing, I think the big conversation people have is fidelity, particularly in intervention. And I would like to just put the idea of compatibility, right? Like, and the randomized control trial, like, that's just not what our schools look like. You know, you don't have gift cards, you don't have people coming in with lunch and like, ooh, big time researchers. We just have teachers who are tired. So like compatibility, how does this work in your school, is the thing that allows people to feel like this is a part of them. When I go to a school and they say, you know, this is what we do as opposed to this is what you told me to do, like I feel like I've accomplished my job. I've done a good job. I can walk away. The challenge is balancing compatibility to like the core pieces of the intervention that actually propel the outcomes, and that's where I'm always trying to figure out like where we get that mix.
And figuring out like for whom and under what circumstances. Like if you look at the What Works Clearinghouse, Department of Ed, you'd be like, it's the What Does Not Work Clearinghouse because nothing has effects, right? Because it works in some places and it doesn't work in some places, and like that's what you would expect, right? And so figuring out how to tailor things and make it flexible enough and figure out what's working for it.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for your embrace.
All right. I want to say thank you again to these three wonderful experts, and I don't think we planned, the level of synergy that you achieved in all of your comments. I think we definitely sought you out because you had a focus on relationships, and that was on purpose, but certainly didn't know that David already was a fan of Dr. Wentzel's work, and that everyone was already kind of familiar with Chicago's work. So thank you for that. But I think I heard two big things. A big theme around empowerment, but empowered with what? So I think empowered with the type of research that Dr. Wentzel talked about, empowered with the type of support and structure that Emily covered that's happening in Chicago with Freshmen on Track, but then also autonomy to do a lot of what David described in terms of actually integrating and embedding. Once you have been empowered with the knowledge, how are you going to have the autonomy, then to go out and make things happen for kids? Because that is the mindset that we think we all bring to the work. But then what we'd like to be able to extend into lunch, to the extent those of you in the room can stay for it, is we heard a lot. As a campaign, we don't want to just bring people together to hear and feel like you took, your continuing education credits for the year. But how does this impact what you do when you go back to your day job? What are the nuggets of information that you take from this kind of meeting and this type of synergy and take back? We don't work with individual students, most of us in this room, and most of us on the phone, but we represent networks of people who do. And so what would it mean to anchor our work in empowerment and autonomy that is going to facilitate the types of relationships that get young people what they need for readiness? That's really our intent with this type of meeting. Because we're not the ones that can mentor a young person that can be part of that web of support beyond our own lives potentially, what is it that we can do in our work and our job? Because we're actually lucky, I just maybe want to say that, we're lucky that we get to be in jobs where we can have an impact on that type of environment for young people. But what is that translation part? I actually can't answer that. That's your autonomous decision. You have to think through that. So we'd like to invite Emily and David and Dr. Wentzel into the conversation here. And we do have lunch here for those of you in the room. Folks on the phone, really appreciate your listening in, and I'm really thrilled that we had such great representation from across so many organizations. I can't emphasize enough how wonderful it was to hear all of your perspectives and the level of synergy. So thank you so much. Folks on the phone, we're going to hang up now. Thank you.
I enjoyed this very much. Yeah.